Let's open medieval maps that were made by contemporary map makers. We see a very large country called Grand Tartarian, and it is not just a couple of maps. Practically all the respected cartographers of that time depict this large country. You can make yourself familiar with hundreds of medieval maps that depict Tartarian, and you can do it on this page. Link is provided in the description. All you need to do is click here, Skачать, and that will download this huge zip file with detailed maps. And although this vast country is all over the maps, and all over the historic writings and documents of that time, it is not even mentioned in the mainstream history. Its name even doesn't exist in its timeline. Let's look further into this. Isn't it a bit strange that the biggest country in the more or less recent history of humanity is not even included in the history textbooks? Couple of thousand years ago, those who survived the cataclysms of Atlantis and Hyperborea, and not only the cataclysms but the subsequent heavy wars, decided to scatter around the world and mix with the relatively primitive tribes that were inhabiting it at that time and educate them. Initially, this educational mission encompassed regions like the Mediterranean, Egypt, and all these cultures that now we call Scythian, Sarmatian, Dacian, and Thracian. People at that time were not yet fenced up in strict borders of countries like us nowadays. But as the controlled demolition of morals and freedom and knowledge was advancing in very rapid rate in the human society, people voluntarily agreed to be divided and further gradually lose their freedoms. As next step, the parasitic forces substituted the pious kings with their own people. They first managed to establish such parasitic governments in the area of Western Europe, while in the East, where the educational project of the survivors was more advanced and people were wiser and more educated, it would take them a few more centuries before the parasites would manage to lower the consciousness of people that much so that they would tolerate corrupted rulers who would be against their own people. After studying the new chronology, it really seems that what we now call the Eastern Roman Empire and Russia were one and the same country. More details were given in the earlier episode on religion. That is why Arabic inscriptions glorifying Allah were all over the weaponry and helmets of the Russian kings, while at the same time the Ottoman rulers were minting coins depicting themselves with the Christian crosses and other symbols that we consider nowadays Christian. Actually, those were times when the two religions were still closer to their source and were not separated as nowadays, and so was the empire of the survivors. It was still one. Actually, in the 15th and 16th century, the last descendants of the righteous Hyperborean rulers decided to use military approach and took over Europe with force. After defeating the strongest countries in Europe, the rest more or less surrendered peacefully. You can find more information of this conquest of Europe and actually a few other continents on this page. It also contains abundant quotes from many authentic historic sources. I will make only 2 episodes on this topic, and they will not even touch all the main points or to speak of any details. In the episode about religion, we reviewed many Arabic or maybe Muslim to us looking artifacts all over Europe that don't fit the mainstream history of this region. One of those artifacts was the so-called Muslim crescent sign on the main cathedral in Vienna. Officially, Vienna was never conquered by Muslims, and officially the crescent is only Muslim sign, so it makes no sense. The stories that we are being told in school about this really don't fit the artifacts. These stories continue telling us how the Ottomans, supposedly the Turks, were holding Vienna under siege, attacking it. But if we look at the actual painting depicting this is the settlement, the tents of those who were holding the siege on the right side, there is a flag with Christian cross on it. So the Ottomans had flags with the Christian crosses along with the crescent flag next to it. On the left side is another old painting depicting this very same siege of Vienna. On the top we see the flag of the city. You can see those are proper buildings inside the city walls, and they have the crescent sign. And below that are the supposedly Ottomans coming out of their tents and attacking the city, and their flag has a Christian cross. Was there some military action? Was there a battle? Yes, there was. Who was fighting with whom? We don't even know, but it is not what they are telling us. And actually on this old drawing we still see the times depicted when Christianity and Islam were one single faith. Now again, this is another old print, that's why the crescent on the top is not very clearly visible, but it is there, and that is another Christian temple. This one is from the German city of Trier. Another very old mural supposedly depicting a Muslim army. Very strange that they have Christian saints on their flags. These are a couple of old stamps and emblems from the time when the Empire of the Survivors was still one, and in the small circles are listed the various nations that are under this supreme emperor, that is the king of all kings. And these are the locations taken from the previous small circles and put on a map. Now this last conquest of the Empire of the Survivors, which by the way I see as a sign of a degradation and not as something good, because I accept no excuse for war. I think the right way is education, but anyway, I'm just registering the events as they happened. That's my task in this video, and not judging them. So this conquest wave spread, it reached even America. Nowadays in the popular media, Christopher Columbus is depicted as some sort of personal name, as some sort of person. They even give some details, but in reality even the mainstream historians, if one reads specialized books, even they admit that Christopher Columbus basically is kind of like translated Christian colonizer. Cristobal Colon or Christopher Colon. Nobody knows where did he come from, where did he die, in descendants or anything. Actually, most likely, when the history was being rewritten, the monks who were compiling the new stories, they thought it's inappropriate to tell the truth, and that's why they put it a kind of Western European sounding name to mask who was actually behind this the wave of survivor expansion. But there are some old chronicles that Fomenko presents in great detail, and for those who are interested, that would cast light on this full Cristobal Colon thing and the so-called discovery of America, which was always well connected with the old world anyway. The episode about America, we saw double eagles on a number of old maps and other items, and that is where the eagle came from the empire of the survivors. That was their stamp. This conquest took place sometime in the 15th and 16th centuries. Spread of epidemic sicknesses contributed to its demise. It is not really sure that the mainstream information about the true nature of these sicknesses is correct and of their origin as well, because some documents of that time suggest that before a certain village would fall a victim to the horrible Black Plague, mysterious people wearing black would appear outside the village and spray something in the air with some sort of devices. But cunning political maneuvering and misleading the general population were the main weapons of the parasitic forces, and at the end they achieved full success exactly as they planned it. They split the survivors into Tartaria and Atamania and made them fight each other. It's very easy to organize war. Just hire a few criminals to commit couple of murders and blame them onto a certain nation, and then tell the other nation that if you don't start fighting them and you don't go to war right now, they will kill you, and tell the same to the other side, and then the ruler gives a command, we are going to war, and the general impression is created that indeed one nation wants to fight the other nation, while in reality wars are destructive for both sides. And to further trick the people into some sort of horror movie that they don't belong to, always some so-called religious slogan is added to make it look really convincing. Indeed, cleanliness is next to godliness, and that is why in Romaic times, in the ancient culture of the survivors, the bathing culture was on a very high level. There was floor heating that would warm, elegant swimming pools. There were toilets with constant running water. Everything was very clean. But when the parasitic forces took over Europe in the Middle Ages, they had to put an end to everything godly. And that's why Europe was reduced to really unbelievably deplorable state of hygiene or lack of such during the Middle Ages. This is how they would dispose of the toilet remains, so to say, of any sort and type. Just throw it out of the window. Well, there were more luxurious options as well, like this one, belonging to rich people, but the lucky one was only the one on the top, and not the unsuspecting bypassers below it, because everything comes out fresh on the street. And so the stilts were invented. And some other specific type of shoes that became fashionable or required at that time, required if you need to pass on a certain street with lots of things fallen on it. Even sophisticated places like palaces, for example Versailles, they didn't have proper toilets with running water. You could do things in the corner or in the staircase or call the servant with a bucket. It all depends on the situation, but basically it happens everywhere. Those who are interested can find genuine descriptions in the books of that time. There were other options. For example, if you were in an assembly and were really busy with something, you could call a servant with a few curtains, and you could do anything without much endeavor or movement around. All this was introduced to lower the consciousness of the human race. And people didn't just sit and watch how all this was happening. They did not like it. They fought back, especially in places like Spain and Britain. They thought it's not good to give up the morals and values and everything that they have inherited from their forefathers and substitute it with the authority of some insurgents, because that's what happened during the Reformation period. Under religious slogans, insurgent kings were installed almost everywhere in Europe. Fortunately, those who fought for the old values and for freedom are now very mistakenly presented in the mainstream history as supporters of some sort of cruel, outdated absolute monarchy. Although that older monarchy was not perfect, as I said, the survivors were already degrading for a long time. Still, that was far better from the slavery, the total slavery that was about to come. To learn more about the truth of those times in great detail, you can read the free books of Anatoly Fomenko. Just a couple of days ago, a new one was added in PDF format. It is still being added, the biggest one. And over there you will find all the details. The Reformation had little to do. It was a very bloody war that took the lives of millions. But why do we see then in the old documents all these slogans against Rome and the absolute authority of Rome? Because the post of Rome was at that time taken by the third Rome, which is Moscow. Eastern European governments embarked on a vast and very active smear campaign against the Tartarians. This is, for example, one of the pamphlets that were handed out right on the streets. On the throne, you see the main mother monster Tartar commanding the others to cruelly kill people before grilling them here on the next step, to eat them, of course. And the pamphlets also were informing the population of Western Europe that when they couldn't get fresh blood to drink, the Tartars would be satisfied just with muddy water. This information was really one of the main weapons of the parasites. Eventually, the parasitic reformators managed to even start a new country in the most western part of Tartaria and named it Russian Empire. That is why on the old maps we see how Tartaria gradually falls apart into few smaller pieces, and as they become weaker and weaker, the newly created empire, of course with insurgent kings, the Romanov dynasty, they devour gradually all of Tartaria. The Tartar kings were in the line of the Hyperborean heritage. They were kind and just to the citizens of their empire, about which we unfortunately know very little, because Romanovs embarked on destruction of all the Hyperborean legacy in fact that the Hyperborean descendants took over a couple of continents during the 15th century greatly disturbed the parasites. It scared them, and that is why even the very name of the country, of the empire of Tartaria, is not even mentioned in the school history books. But not only the past worries them, there is one more thing that disturbs them even more. That's the fact that the parasites, being magicians, black magicians themselves, know what is about to come and how the destiny of this planet is going to change, and an era of wisdom, knowledge, light, and goodness is going to start very soon. When I say magicians, I mean entities in possession of technology that is far beyond ours. After all, that's what we call magic, things that are absolutely incomprehensible for us. And how will that new era come about practically? As many prophets have said in the past, first it is the people, the Slavic people, who live in the region that is nearest to what used to be Hyperborea. They will first become aware that they were tricked into ugly reality, a reality that is artificial and unnatural for the peace-loving, harmonious human beings. This will be covered in detail in the last episode, but for now I will only remind you what Edgar Cayce said, just because he is probably the most familiar for most of my listeners. He said that new times of light will come and it will all start from Russia. But he said it has nothing to do with the government of Russia or any socialism. It will be the people, the simple people on their own, who will start it all. Somebody still finds it difficult to believe that the biggest country that existed is not even included in the history. Here are a few facts. For example, the Encyclopedia Britannica, the most respected edition, according to mainstream historians of its time. It says that Tartaria is a vast country in the northern parts of Asia. After that, the encyclopedia mentions the various types of Tartars, and these are basically all the nations of Europe and Asia that were influenced by the survivors' culture. Tibetan and Chinese Tartars are mentioned as well. They simply held the memory of the survival culture for somewhat a longer time, and that is why they are more spiritual than the people in the West. Another very respected contemporary edition also mentions Tartaria and gives very similar description, this time in Spanish. Later editions of this famous encyclopedia would mention Tartaria again. Another Royal French Encyclopedia mentioning Tartaria as a vast country. Yet another famous edition describing Tartaria as a vast country is the Dictionary of Art and Sciences, printed in London. Even the father of the history fictions that we call history books nowadays, he himself mentions Tartaria. Well, it was very difficult to ignore it at that time. It was still alive. He describes Tartaria as a huge empire that cannot be compared to any other country on earth. The royal French cartographer Sanson also describes Tartaria as a vast country and includes it in his atlas. Ortelius, the most famous medieval cartographer, of course, depicts Tartaria as well on his maps as a separate country. Tartaria was in no way just a mere geographical area. It was a proper country, proper empire, the biggest of all, and further proof are its flag and blazon that are also included in the contemporary historic documents of its era. The French edition of Geographia Universale shows its blazon. And this is a contemporary illustration to the book of Marco Polo, who visited the court of the Tartar kings. Countries also, they have their navy's flags, and when we browse the historic navy flags, we will find that some of them feature one or more flags of Tartaria, which is normal because on the maps we saw that gradually it split into few separate countries before disappearing. This is a Dutch collection of navy flags dating from the beginning of the 18th century. Again, we have two separate flags for Tartaria, an imperial one with a griffin and another one with an owl. Here, an English collection of navy flags also features Tartaria in the same way, and we see it with color now. And endless other editions, it's just many of them. This is an edition of navy flags from US. So all kinds of editions and maps definitely mention Tartaria as a vast country. Tartaria as a country is also all over the literature of the contemporary authors. Characters coming from Tartaria are, for example, in the opera Princess Turandot. In his works, William Shakespeare also features characters coming from Tartaria, and so does Mary Shelley, Charles Dickens, Robert Browning, Geoffrey Chaucer, and many others. And all history books up until the end of the 18th century referred to Tartaria as a great empire, and after that the history forgers just decided to delete it. In this old French edition we can find even a genealogical tree of the rulers of Tartaria. The rulers of the smaller Tartarias made two more attempts to establish the old ways of the survivors using military power. Since mainstream history doesn't even register the existence of those Tartarias, we are being told that those were merely peasant riots. We don't have even a single original document where either Stepan Razin or Emilian Pugachev, the leaders, would tell with their own words what were they fighting for. Of course, and not only about this, if the full history of this Hyperborean region was meticulously cleaned by foreigners and everything was just destroyed or edited or nobody knows where is it. But we have abundance of original documents by the insurgent kings placed by Western Europe at that time to rule the new reformed Russia, with whom Razin and Pugachev were fighting. And even from their version of the story, you will learn really a lot. Every fact that I will present about these so-called riots is taken from the records of the winners, those who killed them. Okay, so what was this all war about? Emilian Pugachev wanted to establish the true king of Russia. But then, according to the insurgent royalties story, there could be no other king of Russia than themselves, ever. So how come Pugachev is taking an army against the king that he is supposedly fighting for? The explanation is that he is fighting against some corrupted people from the court, and he wants to protect the actual king from them. But yet in the books describing the actual military action, when there is mention about the actual situation of the country, what we see is that as Pugachev's army advances and moves through various cities of the region, the people come with joy and celebration. The clergy, the local governors, and everybody comes from far away to greet him, and he issues governmental papers signing them, issuing decrees, and the local governors honoring them as coming from the real king. We don't even know the real name of the last descendant of the Hyperborean kings. This Emilian Pugachev is actually a nickname and not a very respectful one given to him by these insurgents. Eventually won the war and captured him, but it was extremely difficult. Even the queen was considering going to the battlefield because they were losing, and indeed an army came from Western Europe, and that is why Tartaria lost and the newly formed Russia continued existing. Indeed, this was a war that involved a number of countries in Asia and Europe. It wasn't some peasants' gang as they are trying to convince us. Not even clear if army from Western Europe came because the one of the newly formed Russia was not enough in numbers, in strength to defeat Pugachev, or simply because it consisted of Russian soldiers and they refused to fight their own real king, Emilian Pugachev. Eventually he was captured and convicted to death, of course, but the court case against him was not held in a courtroom. It was held in the main hall of Kremlin. You don't do that with gangs of peasants. It was a matter of necessity. The insurgent kings knew who was the real king, and that's why the court case had to be conducted there. During the time of his execution, these insurgent kings were well aware what they are doing. Were afraid of the people on the street. A large number of Western European military troops was present to ensure that everything goes according to their plan. Insurgent royalty after that made their own history, their own version of the story, and they send messengers all over Russia and Tartaria to read this story to the ordinary people and tell them that talking anything else is forbidden. For many years, every person who could have had any access to any original documents connected with Emilian Pugachev was hunted down and tortured to death until they get even the last hold of every original document from him. By special royal decree, commissions were formed responsible for going to the area from where Pugachev came from, and they had to rename each and every single thing in that area, including rivers, villages, anything you can think of, so that every last memory of the Hyperborean dynasty is erased forever. Vague remarks in some old texts suggest that Emilian Pugachev could have had a young son that was taken to safety to probably China or even Japan, where the last isolated pockets of survivor culture was still thriving. And now is the time to remember that episode on Japan about Tokugawa Ieyasu shogun and the last wave of survivors that founded the samurai Japan period. Some of the surviving army of the Tartars founded the samurai dynasty, while others founded the Manchu dynasty in China. Do you remember the wonderful royal palace in China with European looks? It's not actually European, it is survivor style. And a lot of this style was there in Tartaria, but it was just leveled to the ground and continues to be leveled nowadays with bulldozers we saw in previous episode. Well, that palace was plundered by the French colonial military forces. This is what they left behind. The very same party started hunting down the last pockets of people who were keeping the old survivor culture, hunting them down like animals. That's why the same imperial forces landed on the banks of Japan and demanding to end the isolation of Japan. Those same forces went to Egypt as well, murdered the Mamelukes, the last keepers of the Egyptian secrets, and started plundering and destroying whatever they can over there. Those same military forces arrived in Burma and in Khmer in Cambodia and did the very same cleanup. Whatever survivor culture you can find, just shoot it, loot it, destroy it. There were other strongholds in Ethiopia, in Patagonia, and in Alaska, but of course it was just a question of time and they would get cleaned up eventually as well. Now this is a map from the time when Tartaria still existed. North America was still largely under its influence, so that's why Western European cartographers could not even map the continent fully. Emelian Pugachev was defeated in year 1775, and probably that was the end of Tartaria as well. Immediately the Western European forces immediately rushed to establish their reign over the vast lands of America that now has ended up without a master. And that is why, within one short year, officially the country of United States was formed. In the beginning, its laws were still largely based on the survivor laws of respect and integrity, because somehow or other they needed to put the people voluntarily into a position that they would obey central control. But now let's return to 15th, 16th century Europe, when it was under control of Tartaria. Why don't we find this in our school books, in the official mainstream history? Why do we read that there were separate kings for each country? Actually, the fact that the European rulers were subservient to one single ruler has reached us, but in somewhat distorted forms. One of the forms we'll discuss in the next episode, but now we'll only mention Prester John. Mainstream historians assure us that the stupid medieval people didn't even know who is ruling them, and that's why they were under the strange impression that some sort of strange fable king, Prester John, was the king of all kings. Even mainstream historians frankly admit the fable was quite widespread. That's an easy one. You just say it's a fable, it's a fairy tale, and then you don't need to include the historical documents because they're a fable, right? In Wikipedia, the encyclopedia of every good sheep, they don't even want to tell us exactly what is the legend. They're starting the talk with some Christian patriarchs and Oriental Magis and Ethiopians and so on, and they're not even telling you what is the legend all about. And namely, that he was the king above all other rulers. And of course, Prester John is considered a great mystery. We know this formula: declare it a mystery and then you can exclude it from history. Okay, so they decided, we'll just delete Tartaria from history and everything is solved. But then what about the actual cultural heritage? After all, the citizens of Tartaria were greatly influenced by this Hyperborean and Atlantean culture, and they knew the real history as well. That needs to be corrected, so they sent a professional cleaning service, just one call for all. The Romanov, the insurgent rulers of the newly formed Russian Empire, started a massive operation of removal and destruction of everything that could give hints about the advanced civilization that existed in these regions before. Special commissions and expeditions were organized and sent out to dig any possible old burials and take out all the artifacts, including the human remains as well. Only now and then some occasional artifact by mistake will reach us, like for example giant armors that would fit a man that are 2.5 meters high, or maybe this human tooth. It's just normal human tooth, just it is more than twice the size of something like that. I'm not sure how many times it's bigger than a normal one, but it is a tooth of a giant and it is in the museum of Pozhrinskом. But of course, serious scientists, they will never do DNA or any other test on such teeth. Serious scientists, they spend their time doing more meaningful things, like for example, copy, paste and improve diagrams like this of our real family. The Romanovs ordered absolute demolition of some of the main temples of Tartaria, and the work was going on at night because they were afraid that people will just attack the demolishers if they do it daytime. Whatever temples remained, they ordered their murals to be stripped down from the walls. Because a lot of history, of course, is being written down on the murals. This is how the walls of these stripped temples look till nowadays. They were not just painted over, it was ordered that they're chiseled out of the walls. So important was for them to make this information unavailable. Mainstream historians assure us that all this operation was because the Romanovs wanted to make new, fresher and more beautiful murals. How can I believe this if they haven't started even painting and some of those that destroyed were freshly painted? They not only ordered the destruction and burning of every old book they could find, yes, it was a very thorough cleanup, but they also went after the musical instruments of people. They had to submit the organs and other very nice instruments, and now in Russian history we read that they were never there. Because, as everybody knows, in that region people came out of monkeys just so recently. But clouding the people's consciousness, robbing them of their wisdom was the main point. And there is trick for everything. Alcohol, drinking. It was made compulsory. It was really introduced by force in the Russian society. They made it compulsory for soldiers. They also organized some sort of special church services in which drinking was compulsory, and also under religious slogans, because you have to be a good Christian, you had to submit papers that you have been regularly attending those services. This is just crazy, and so taught the peoples. They were a riot against this compulsory alcohol introduction. At times, people just organized themselves and went to destroy the factories and decide to tell we want an end to all this. This is destroying our society. But of course, those riots were subdued by military force, and more free alcohol was distributed as a gift to the society. And then comes the next step, how to convince perfectly normal people that they're monkeys. Well, and so comes the Russian academia, supposedly representing historical science or historical records. Please, here for your attention, I present a full list of the Russian historians and scientists of those times. Please, just have a look at their names, that's more than enough. These were mostly Germans who were hired there on a mission. They didn't hide it. The main compiler of Russian history was a certain German person who spent in Russia over, 20, 30 years. He never cared to learn Russian. He said, I'm not here for that. I'm here to tell them what to do. Another Russian historian from Germany, he even learned Russian. He went to Siberia. He found hundreds of old books. If that really existed, it must have been a fantastic heritage for the full humanity. Very ancient books, and so many of them revealing the full history of the planet. Well, according to his own words, he compiled the Russian history based on them. After he left with the compiled history, nobody ever saw or heard anything about those books anymore. This graph shows the percentage of foreigners in the history department of the Russian Academy of Sciences. As you understand, it is this Academy of Sciences that decides what is to be written in the history school books. Basically, this was just a hired personnel by the descendants of the Western European reformators who were continuing their cleanup through the centuries. And not only history, every bit of information about science or technology or anything left from Hyperborean times needed to be removed. Now this graph shows the percentage of foreigners in the full Academy of Sciences of the Russian Empire since it was founded and for the first 200 years of its existence. Basically all history, all knowledge, everything technology that is accessible to humans in this region of ex-Hyperborea was under foreign control for a long time before they could wipe the memory of the locals almost completely. Almost. Somebody would ask, such a vast country, Russian Empire, did they have their own historians so they had to import foreign ones for 200 years? Of course, there were plenty of good local historians, but they were not admitted in the mainstream academia because that was under the control of the insurgent kings who were just Western European puppets. For example, Lomonosov, a famous Russian historian at that time, he spent all his life trying to uh, establish the real Russian history. There were advanced nations living there. We had history for many thousands of years. Now our calendar is 7,000 years old. But he was not even allowed to print out his book and publish his opinion. He was just banned from doing that. And then all of a sudden he was killed. At the very same time, his collection of old books actually disappeared. And surprise, surprise, immediately upon his death, his books were printed in large numbers. And surprise, surprise, his so-called books had nothing to do with what he was trying to prove all his life, but were actually written by those German personnel that came to establish the reformed history. So they basically printed out their books under his name, under the name of local Russian respected historians, so that it will look more authentic. And all these tricks are now called historic science. This is just surrealistic, such a distortion of history. It's unbelievable. But believe it or not, even under these conditions, at those times, they were closer to the truth even than us. I mean, we're really the bottom of the abyss of history. Even at that time, just a couple of centuries ago, they accepted many of the nations that are now declared to be fairy to be real inhabitants, actual people who lived in the cold regions of Russia that are now very scarcely populated. But even this scarce population that is there now, they also, all of them, although it's a very big region, they all have different legends, but it all boils down to the same thing. There were a lot of people who lived here before, very tall Caucasian people, magicians, but they were at war with some entities from out there from space. They were at war and they lost the war. They were killed. Even under the dreadful conditions I described before, there was a royal archaeological organization. They visited the sites where these fairy nations resided and found their settlements or remains of them. Now, following this old location of their assumed settlements, Nikolai Subotin organized expedition to those exact places. And what did he find there? He found all these dams and other large earthworks that I have been showing in the previous episodes were connected to the earth lifelines and are found all over all continents basically. So we are definitely on to something here, and it's not just the dams. It's very unusual artifacts surface now and then, like this stone, probably even a megalithic staircase. Okay, but out there, kilometers, maybe on 100 kilometers of around, there is nothing, and in the historic record of this full region, there is no population ever. Unusual round formations, couple of meters in diameter. This is not a natural formation. Giant footprint. Where did that come from? A stone with a machine mark cuts. It's few meters long. Somebody calculated that if it was done with modern equipment, they would need a disc diameter of 10 meters to do it. Who would transport such an equipment there? It's done in the rock. There is no road or any civilization hundreds of kilometers around. And we are being assured that nobody ever lived there. Till date, archaeologists find sometimes the wrong thing, like the so-called Alexeyevsky Kamni. They are trying to push them to some Paleolithic times, but doesn't matter wherever they push them, it still doesn't work because the question remains how were they made, because they consist of very unusual composite materials and elements that are inaccessible or impossible to extract, and the technology that would allow production of anything like this is available just since few decades or something like that. How did the monkeys could find rare materials that are barely available on planet Earth and make special things like this? Thing, whatever it is, we don't even still have names for this. When you rub it, sparks come out of it, strong ones along with the ultraviolet light. Can we make this anything that emits ultraviolet when you rub it? I doubt. And it's not just one. Another almost identical stone was again excavated during archaeological works hundreds of kilometers away from the first one. Of course, all this is classified as deep historical mystery. Peter Kazansky was an international lawyer and spent many years working in the biggest libraries of Europe, like that of Brussels, Berlin, Brno, and Paris. He wrote, "We live in an amazing historic moment when languages and nations are artificially divided and even new ones are being fabricated." You can find out more how artificial language reforms contributed to wiping out the memory of the common people in Europe in the works of Anatoly Fomenko. But still, I would like to point out two things that seem extremely suspicious to me in terms of the official history of languages. First of all, the transit from hieroglyphic to alphabetic writing. Did it really happen naturally? I really doubt so. First of all, the pictographic writing or the hieroglyphs is much easier. The proof is that nowadays we are gradually turning to pictograms. You see the computer desktop items? It's so much easier when you see the sign to immediately figure out, and it's not difficult to learn. You just know them automatically because you grew up in this environment. So hieroglyphs could be difficult for those who start to study them when they are 40, but when you grow up in a society that uses them, you learn much faster, and also it develops those areas of your brain that are also responsible for meditation. So actually, using alphabetic writing is not only more difficult, but also makes us more like machines, not like natural beings. There were no pictograms and only text on your computer, just the full text only page. It would take you so much more time to read everything until you find where is this button, because it all looks like letters, while with pictogram it's so much faster and easier. And if you are not yet fully convinced, here is one more point. Well, people who think pictograms are more difficult, like in Chinese and Japanese language, they say, my God, you have to learn a few thousand signs before you even learn the language, and here you just learn 30 alphabetic easy signs and you're done. Are you done really? Let's say, take the phrase magnetic field. Two words, simple, just couple of letters, and you can read it, and God knows how many hieroglyphs you need to write for that in Chinese, right? But wait a minute, you forget that you had to go 10, 20 years to school to understand what is a magnetic field. It doesn't come automatically inbuilt just in the letters of the phrase. You have to do the learning anyway. It is just structured differently. Since pictogrammic writing or hieroglyphs are much easier, why would we go to alphabetic writing? Why would we get into something more difficult? Most likely it happened artificially. All this myth of Babylon, it either happened a few times in our history, always using the same trick again, because when they destroy our language knowledge, then we cannot read the old scriptures and get access to the magical knowledge, even if somehow we find those books. I really think the language reform were part of this big program of thorough wipeout of the culture and the magical knowledge we had. And the other thing that looks very fishy to me is how languages evolved naturally in Europe. Well, languages do evolve naturally, but that doesn't mean that somebody cannot help them externally under certain conditions. So all these like evolutionary tree of languages, they belong to various subgroups and then bigger groups and then families and all that, and it is all strictly categorized and completely figured out. But is it really figured out, or they just want us to think so? Some of their parallels and similarities seem pretty made up to me, like, oh, in this language they had the god of joy was Ra, and because in the other Radast means joy, and that's why these languages should be in this subgroup, and all that really very fishy arguments sometimes. And then we are told that the original language spread and it became different because nations relocated. But wait a minute, the original relocation, according to mainstream history, was some, I don't know, around 30,000 years ago. The full planet, they tell us, was more or less populated everywhere. So what the languages, again, according to them, the language as we speak them nowadays, they appeared at much later stage. So what was there a second absolute grand relocation just for the languages? No, there wasn't. There were occasional movements for sure, but not exactly that when it came time to divide the languages, everybody just relocated, and that's why every language belongs only to certain group. Okay, I mean, another group of people could have come, but there were local people there as well, right? So what, their language just disappears and evaporates like that, so that the new one can come and everything can fit this history? Most likely, this full language tree thing is, as usual, mixture of truth and fiction and fantasy, and it is just artificially made to resemble the history, to the fabricated history, to kind of confirm it, and only partially responds to the actual development of languages. In the previous episodes, on many occasions, we saw examples of extreme reluctance to study any ancient writing that doesn't fit this tree that we see in the history textbooks. The fabrication of a history is an ongoing mission. For example, when the parasites figured out that since couple of years people are starting to talk about Tartarian, they made a smart move. They issued a very expensive and very luxury book, Tartarian. And very generously, many libraries in Russia and all kinds of educational institutions received the general gifts of editions for free of this book. So I will tell you in short the content of this book. There is a tribe, wild tribe. They kill a horse, they hang it on a tree, worship it for some time, and then eat it. And that's all. When they get free time from horse worship, they engage in stealing. And then the next tribe is described, and it's doing exactly the same. And then the next tribe and the next tribe, and it seems they're all doing the same thing. Were there indeed such tribes in Tartaria? I'm sure there were some. But what about all the other things? Well, indeed, there was one sketch of some sort of building there, but there was no mention who built it. It must have built itself. No wonder they were making such generous gifts to the libraries. Viktor Ilyushin was a very high-ranking politician and a deputy in Russia. He discovered a full laboratory team of forgers who were already working into forging Second World War history artifacts and documents and making the full story look completely not what it was. And so he started a military tribunals, a court case against the government that was supporting and organizing all that. When it all started, he all of a sudden died in perfect health in his own home for a known reason, and the tribunal was closed. Why do I mention this? Because honest people of integrity are there in every government. Even though the agenda of the government as a whole is usually completely different, still we must understand that the change will come only gradually. And as our consciousness and our memory of our history, who we are, clears up gradually, more and more people of integrity will be there in the governments. Most people in most countries have simply given up on politicians. They don't vote, they are not politically active because they have lost hope that there are any honest politicians at all. But the truth is that there are honest politicians, but they're still very few because we are not educated enough to recognize and support them.